There was a stillness in the countryside that Margaret hadn't felt in years, a kind of silence that wrapped itself around the soul like a blanket. The gravel of the driveway crunched under the tires of her car as she pulled up to the old house. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel a moment longer than they needed to, fingers tightening and loosening rhythmically. The wind pushed a few late October leaves across the windshield. Her heart beat just a little too loudly for a family visit. She told her husband she'd only be gone for the weekend. He hadn't questioned it. James rarely did. After 22 years of marriage, their communication had evolved into something more functional than emotional. And yet, there was a quiet loyalty between them, if not passion. The kind of marriage that others might describe as solid, though Margaret, in her more honest moments, often thought comfortable was a better word. Maybe stale on the worst days. The house looked the same, though the years had been kinder to the structure than to most of the people inside it. She stepped out of the car, her boots pressing into the damp earth, the smell of distant chimney smoke blending with something floral, lilacs, maybe, or the scent of her mother's perfume lingering in the air, as if time hadn't moved forward here like it had everywhere else. Margaret. The voice came from the porch, low and familiar, but with a resonance she didn't recognize at first. She looked up, and time did something strange. Her breath caught, not from shock, but from something warmer, deeper. A man was leaning against the wooden railing, arms folded, smile easy. He was older now, obviously, but the shape of his face, the color of his eyes, it was unmistakable. "Daniel," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. He came down the steps with that same relaxed gait she remembered from her late teens, though now there was something else about him. Broader shoulders, touches of silver at his temples, a deeper calm behind his expression. They hadn't seen each other in nearly 20 years. Her mother had married his father when they were both in college. They'd lived together only briefly during one summer, a time that had burned itself into her memory more vividly than she liked to admit. Daniel opened his arms without hesitation, and she walked into them before she had time to second-guess. He held her close, longer than necessary, and she felt the heat of his body even through her coat. "Still not a hugger, I see," he teased, pulling back slightly to look at her face. His grin was crooked, charming. "I've been known to allow one or two exceptions," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. They stood for a moment in that familiar, slightly awkward closeness. No longer teenagers, not quite strangers, not quite family. And yet, something deeper swirled just beneath the surface. The kind of connection that comes from sharing space at a formative time, the kind that doesn't always obey rules or titles. Inside, the house was full of chatter. Her mother had gone all out for her 70th, insisting on a big family gathering. Nieces, nephews, cousins she barely remembered. Margaret was only supposed to stay 2 nights, but already she could feel the years folding in on themselves. The scent of rosemary roast and her mother's signature cranberry tart wafted from the kitchen, and Daniel's eyes kept finding hers across the room. It wasn't anything overt, just small moments. The way he handed her a glass of wine with a subtle brush of fingers. The warmth in his voice when he asked about her work, her kids. The way his gaze lingered half a second too long. She caught herself doing it too, watching the way he leaned against the doorframe, how he laughed more with his eyes than his mouth. There was something undeniably easy about being near him, a comfort that bordered on dangerous. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the younger cousins had gone off with beers and board games, Margaret found herself on the back porch. The sky was unusually clear. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and looked up at the stars. "You always used to come out here after dinner." She turned. Daniel was holding 2 glasses of bourbon, offering one. She took it without hesitation. "Have it, I guess," she said. "The quiet helps me think." He leaned against the railing beside her. "What are you thinking about?" She hesitated. "Everything. Nothing. Life, mostly." He sipped his drink. "Still with James?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah. Still am." "And happy?" The question hung between them longer than it should have. She smiled tightly. "Define happy." Daniel's laugh was low, understanding. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Just shared. I almost forgot how peaceful it is here, she murmured. I never forgot, he said, and there was something in his tone that made her glance sideways at him. You stayed nearby all these years? He nodded. An hour or so north. Came back when Dad got sick. Ended up sticking around after he passed. Something about this place. I don't know. It keeps you. Margaret looked at him fully now. The shadows softened the edges of his face, but there was no mistaking the intensity in his expression. You haven't changed much, she said, and immediately regretted how intimate it sounded. I have, he said, but not the part that remembers you. There it was, clear, unmistakable, and no longer hidden behind playful glances or sibling small talk. Something passed between them that neither could deny. Margaret turned back to the stars, her heart suddenly alive in her chest. This is crazy, she whispered, more to herself than him. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He just stood beside her and said, maybe, or maybe it's just been waiting. That night, she lay in the old guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, her skin prickling with an electricity she hadn't felt in years. Her body remembered things her mind had tried to bury, how it felt to be seen, truly seen, not as a wife or mother or responsible daughter, but as a woman. Desired. Noticed. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed that until now. The sheets smelled like lavender and thyme. The house creaked softly in the wind. And somewhere down the hall, Daniel was probably still awake. Thinking. Wondering. Just like her. In the morning, nothing had changed on the surface. Coffee was poured, family members laughed over old photo albums, her mother beamed as people made toasts about grace and longevity. But underneath it all, something had shifted. Daniel's eyes met hers over breakfast, and the warmth in her chest told her the story was only just beginning. The second day had that strange weight to it, the kind that settles into your skin when something invisible but irrevocable has shifted inside you. The air was the same, the sky the same gray-blue expanse over the hills, and yet Margaret walked through it as if every tree, every familiar hallway in her mother's house, now watched her with quiet curiosity. Or maybe judgment. She couldn't tell. Daniel was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. Just him. The others were still asleep or out for morning walks, the kind of slow, meandering rituals family gatherings seemed to encourage. He was shirtless beneath an old flannel, half-buttoned, sleeves rolled up. The coffee machine gurgled behind him as he turned, caught sight of her, and smiled. Morning, he said, like nothing had changed and everything had. Morning, she replied, wrapping her cardigan tighter as if it could somehow block the heat that pulsed inside her. He handed her a mug. Their fingers brushed. Again, longer than necessary. She sat at the kitchen table while he leaned against the counter, both quiet for a while. The only sound was the soft tick of the clock and the occasional chirp of birds outside. You sleep okay? He asked. She nodded. Eventually, a pause. Then, me too. Neither said what they were really thinking, which hovered between them like the low fog outside the window, thick, cool, and inescapable. Later that afternoon, after lunch and another round of polite family stories, Margaret wandered out to the barn. It was mostly unused now. Her mother had sold the horses years ago, but the smell of hay and dust and old wood remained, like memory itself had taken up permanent residence in the beams. She didn't expect him to follow her. I thought you might be out here, Daniel said softly as he stepped through the door. She was sitting on an upturned crate, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust on her jeans. I needed a little air. I know the feeling. She looked at him. What is this? She asked finally, her voice low, but not unsteady. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. It's unfinished. From a long time ago, and maybe not as gone as we thought. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. You're not my brother, she said. Not really. But it's still complicated, he finished. She nodded, then added, almost reluctantly, James and we haven't really been close. In years. Daniel stepped closer, but not too close. Are you happy with him? She looked up, eyes meeting his, something raw rising inside her. I don't know. I used to think happiness was a luxury. Now I think maybe I just stopped expecting it. His jaw flexed slightly, but he said nothing. They stayed like that for a long moment, neither speaking. Then, as if drawn by gravity or instinct or simply the years of something unspoken finally finding its shape, he stepped forward and kissed her. It was not tentative, not delicate. It was firm, familiar, and shockingly natural. Her mouth responded before her mind caught up, lips parting, breath catching, one hand rising almost involuntarily to touch the stubble on his jaw. He tasted like bourbon and coffee and heat. She pulled back first.
Barely.
This is wrong, she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Then tell me to stop. But she didn't. The second kiss was slower, more exploratory. His hands settled at her waist, hers on his chest. The flannel slipped from his shoulders. She felt the warmth of his skin through her thin blouse. A moan, hers, escaped without permission. They didn't go further that afternoon. Not physically, at least. Something held them back, perhaps a fragment of decency or fear. But what had been set in motion couldn't be undone. Margaret walked back to the house with a pulse thrumming at the base of her spine and a guilt that didn't outweigh the thrill. Not even close. That night, she found herself looking for him across the room during dinner, watching his hands as he carved the roast, watching the way his throat moved when he laughed, watching him watch her. And when he lingered a second too long at her side while pouring wine, she felt a blush bloom high on her cheeks that had nothing to do with alcohol. Back in her childhood bedroom, Margaret lay awake again. Her body was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Every nerve seemed to hum with anticipation, memory, and something dangerously close to hunger. She thought about James, about their last weekend away, an awkward anniversary in a bland hotel room where they'd barely touched each other. She thought about the way he always kissed her forehead now, never her mouth, about the sex, which had become more routine than passionate, when it happened at all. And she thought about Daniel, about his hands, his eyes, the way his body had pressed into hers with confident need. She touched her own lips, remembering the weight of his kiss. The next day passed in a blur of small talk and casseroles, phone calls and photo albums. But Margaret's thoughts were elsewhere. And when the crowd began thinning, some cousins driving home, others leaving for hotels, her nerves rose. It was their last night together in that house. That evening, Margaret offered to help clean up. Daniel joined her, rinsing dishes at the sink while she dried. They moved around each other easily. Too easily, bumping hips, sharing smiles. Her hand brushed his waist once, and he didn't move away. When her mother yawned and announced she was going to bed, Margaret nearly dropped a plate. Alone, finally, in the quiet kitchen with the light low and the moon full outside, they stood facing each other. I don't want to go back yet, she said quietly. He stepped closer, cupped her cheek. Then don't. This time, there was no hesitation. No second-guessing. His mouth claimed hers with a need that was equal parts memory and urgency. She melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer. They kissed like people who'd waited decades for it. Deep, slow, desperate. He lifted her onto the counter with surprising ease, and she gasped as his hands moved beneath her blouse. Her skin burned beneath his touch, every nerve lighting up as he traced the edge of her bra, the swell of her hip. She clung to him, kissing him harder, hungrier. She let herself forget. Let herself be something other than a wife, a mother, a responsible woman. She let herself become only sensation. When they finally broke apart, breathless and flushed, he rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted this since we were kids, he murmured. I just didn't know how badly. I thought I'd buried it, she said, still trying to catch her breath. But it's always been there. He kissed her again, slower this time, more reverent, as if memorizing her. That night, she didn't sleep in her childhood bed. She followed him down the hall, quietly, barefoot, heart racing. His room smelled of cedar and clean sheets. When he touched her again, it was different, more deliberate, more intense. Her blouse came off easily. Then her bra. His mouth was warm against her skin, his hands steady as he explored her body like a man who wasn't rushing anything. She arched into him, her breath shaky, her fingers gripping his hair. When they finally came together, it was slow, intimate, deep. A rhythm that spoke of years missed, not just minutes taken. He moved inside her with reverence, hands cradling her as if she might disappear. She cried out, not from pain or pleasure alone, but from release, from being seen, known. After, he held her. They didn't speak. The silence was its own kind of music. And still, even as her eyes closed and sleep began to pull her under, Margaret knew this wasn't an ending. It was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The morning after had a strange quiet to it, not awkward, but sacred, as if even the wind outside knew something had changed. Margaret woke tangled in sheets that weren't hers, in a bed that smelled like pine and sweat and something deliciously human. Daniel lay beside her, chest bare, arm flung over her waist. His breathing was deep, steady, unbothered. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. In another life, maybe one where they hadn't been raised under the same roof for that single strange summer, where her mother hadn't married his father, where she hadn't gone off to marry James out of what now felt like inertia, maybe she and Daniel would have had a chance. But this wasn't that life. She had two grown children, a husband who, while inattentive and dull, had never betrayed her, a house, a routine, a history. And yet her body, even now, sang from the night before. She eased out of bed, careful not to wake him. Her clothes were scattered, a trail of decisions, and she gathered them one piece at a time, every motion reminding her of touch, heat, breath. Downstairs, the house was still mostly asleep. She made herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table in silence, watching the light shift across the tiles. Her fingers tapped against a mug, nervous and unsure. When she heard his footsteps, she didn't turn around right away. He came up behind her, rested his hands gently on her shoulders, and kissed the crown of her head. "No regrets?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. Regret isn't the right word. What is? Complicated. He pulled a chair beside her. Shirtless, his skin still warm from bed, he didn't look like a mistake. He looked like something fate had forgotten to finish. "I know what this is, Margaret," he said. "And I know it's not simple. I'm not asking for promises. But I can't pretend it didn't mean something." She looked at him. It did. A pause. Then she whispered, "It still does." For the rest of the day, they behaved impeccably. Margaret played the part of devoted daughter, Daniel the helpful son. No one noticed how their hands brushed in the hallway, how they lingered near each other in the kitchen. But inside, everything had changed. As the sun began to set, guests slowly filtered out. Her mother cried, as she always did, hugging Margaret too tight and too long. "You come back soon, all right?" she said. Margaret promised she would. And she meant it. Just not for the reasons her mother assumed. Daniel walked her to the car, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. When she turned to him, keys in hand, they didn't speak at first. "I don't want this to end here," he said finally. "I don't think it can," she said. He leaned in, kissed her gently, this time on the mouth, but soft, almost reverent. Not with hunger, with memory, with gratitude, and with hope. She drove away with his taste still on her lips and a confusion in her chest that no amount of distance could solve. The return home was surreal. James greeted her with his usual distracted affection, half watching a tennis match on the TV as he hugged her and took her bag. "Everything go all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Mom's well." Daniel was there. He nodded. "Haven't seen him in a long time." Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she unpacked slowly, methodically, as if sorting socks and travel-sized shampoo could help reorder her soul. The days that followed were full of small betrayals. Not the loud, messy kind. The quiet ones. The way she found herself daydreaming while James spoke about his latest project. The way she hesitated before replying to his casual touch. The way she caught her own reflection in the mirror, flushed, distracted, somehow different. Daniel texted the next day. Just one sentence. Are you okay? She stared at the message for 10 minutes before replying. I don't know. He didn't push. And yet they kept talking. Slowly. Cautiously. A few texts a day. Then calls. At first, she justified it, family talk, catching up. But the tone shifted quickly. Memories were revisited. Jokes turned intimate. Flirting emerged like a reflex they'd both long forgotten. He remembered the summer she turned 21 and wore a red sundress with bare shoulders. She remembered the way he used to swim at night, alone in the dark pool, lit only by the underwater lights. It was dangerous, this nostalgia. It made the present feel unreal. One evening, after a long day of errands and polite conversation with James, Margaret stood in the kitchen chopping onions and crying, not because of the onions, because she felt utterly split in half. That night, she and James made love. It was mechanical, brief, without fire. She closed her eyes and imagined Daniel's breath on her neck, the way his body had felt against hers. When she came, it wasn't her husband's name in her head. She hated herself a little for that. And yet she couldn't stop. The next time they saw each other was 2 weeks later. She made an excuse. Mom needs help with the house. I'll stay a couple nights. James barely looked up from his laptop. Daniel met her halfway in a small town off the highway. They got a room in a modest, slightly old-fashioned inn with floral drapes and a creaky mattress. It didn't matter. He kissed her as soon as the door closed. Desperate, hungry, like he'd been starving. I haven't stopped thinking about you, he whispered into her skin. I know, she said. Me either. They didn't undress slowly. They tore at each other, laughter and need mixing as buttons popped and zippers caught. Her blouse hit the floor. His belt clattered. They stumbled backward toward the bed. This time it wasn't reverent. It was raw. Urgent. He made her come twice, once with his mouth, once with his hands, before he entered her. She cried out louder than she meant to. He silenced her with a kiss. They slept in tangled sheets, skin on skin. Nos jam. Just heat, sweat, and sleep. In the morning, he made coffee in the little hotel pot, handed it to her with a grin. This is insane, she said. It is. But we're not stopping. No, he said. We're not. And they didn't. Over the next 3 months, they met whenever they could. Midway points. Afternoons. Long walks that turned into long nights. They made love in cheap hotels and on the blanket in the back of her car, parked under trees. They talked about the past and the future. Sometimes they fought about what it meant, where it could go. But they never walked away. Back home, Margaret became a version of herself she barely recognized. Distracted. Alive. Torn. James noticed eventually. You've been different, he said one evening. I'm just thinking about a lot, she replied, not lying. Not really. He nodded, accepting it. As always, he didn't ask the questions he didn't want the answers to. One night, after another hotel meeting, Daniel turned to her in bed, brushed hair from her face. I want more, he said. Her chest tightened. I don't know if I can give you more. I know, but I want it too. He nodded slowly, pulling her against him. They lay there in silence, both knowing something would have to give. Soon. Margaret didn't remember falling asleep. Just the soft rhythm of Daniel's breathing against her shoulder, the warmth of his arm curled around her hip, and then light. Morning always broke too soon when they were together. Hotels had a cruel way of reminding her that time still moved forward, indifferent to her choices. She sat up in the bed, covers pooling around her waist, and stared at the window. The curtains were half-drawn, sunlight filtering through the sheer linen like diluted gold. Daniel stirred behind her and reached lazily toward her back, trailing his fingers along her spine. You're already thinking, he murmured. I never stop. He sat up beside her, rested his chin on her shoulder, his beard rough against her skin. I love you, he said. Just like that. No flirts. No demand. Just the truth. She turned to him. I know. That was the thing about it. She did know. She'd known it since the barn. Since his mouth first touched hers. Since that kiss that unlocked something buried for decades. And yet, love, she'd learned, didn't always equate to possibility. It could swell, overflow, and still be boxed in by 100 invisible walls. They made love again that morning, slow, deliberate. It wasn't wild like the first time, or desperate like the nights that followed. It was something else, a goodbye neither of them said out loud. At least not yet. When she pulled away, dressing in the silence that always felt like guilt, he didn't stop her. But his eyes followed her every motion, his expression unreadable. I can't keep doing this forever, he said softly. Meeting in shadows. Margaret nodded. I know. What are we waiting for? He asked. She looked down at her hands, at the thin gold band around her finger. I've built the life. A quiet one. But it's mine. And leaving it's not a small thing. You're not happy. No, she admitted. But I've forgotten what happy looks like. I don't even know if I believe in it anymore. Daniel stood. He didn't yell, didn't plead. He simply walked toward her, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her forehead. I do, he whispered. That was the last time she saw him for a while. They didn't end things, not with final words. But they stopped meeting. No texts. No calls. The silence between them stretched, long, aching, and full of everything unsaid. At home, life returned to its dull rhythm. James was, as he always was, kind, polite, distracted. He never suspected, or if he did, he didn't have the will to confront it. Margaret drifted through days like a ghost, wearing the skin of a woman who'd once had color in her cheeks, fire in her blood. But something had shifted. She couldn't go back fully. She started walking every morning before sunrise. Sometimes she'd cry without warning. Other times, she'd stop and stand under trees and wonder who she'd be if she let it all burn. Marriage, motherhood, propriety. One afternoon, she drove aimlessly until she ended up by the coast. There was a pier there, old and creaky, and she stood at the edge, watching the water move like breath. Her phone buzzed. It had been nearly a month. Daniel, are you okay? She didn't answer right away. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she typed, I'm not sure I'll ever be okay again, but I'm still breathing. The reply came seconds later. Do you want me to stop loving you? Tears blurred the screen. I want it to be easier. But no. I don't want you to stop. Then don't shut me out. We don't have to have answers right now. But we already crossed the line. We can't uncross it. No. But we can live with it. Or make something new from it. We just have to decide. That night, Margaret sat across from James at the dinner table. He was talking about a colleague's retirement party, but she didn't hear him. Not really. She watched his hands. The way he held his fork. The way he didn't look at her unless he had to. James, she said suddenly. He stopped. Yeah. She put her fork down. Are you happy? He blinked. With what? With me. With us. He leaned back, thoughtful. I don't really ask that question anymore. Maybe we should. A long pause. Are you? He asked. No, she said. Not really. He nodded slowly, like he'd known but hadn't wanted it said aloud. They didn't fight, didn't cry. They just sat there in the quiet recognition of a marriage that had become more habit than home. I don't hate you, he said. I know. I don't want to lose everything. I don't think we had everything to begin with, she whispered. James stood up, walked around the table, and kissed the top of her head. Then he went to the living room and turned on the television. That was the end. Quiet, almost gentle. A week later, Margaret packed 2 suitcases and moved into a small apartment closer to her mother's house. She didn't tell Daniel. Not yet. She needed to know she was doing it for herself. The first night alone, she cooked herself pasta and drank a glass of red wine on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived. She cried. She laughed. She slept for 11 hours. In the morning, she texted Daniel. I left. He replied almost instantly. Where are you? Here. Finally. He showed up 2 hours later with coffee and wildflowers and the look of a man who had waited a very long time for something he didn't dare hope was real. They didn't talk much. He just pulled her close, held her like a storm survivor clinging to land. And that night, when he undressed her in the dim light of her new bedroom, it wasn't desperate or stolen. It was the first time they touched as people no longer hiding, as people choosing each other. When he entered her, slow and deep, she let herself cry. Not from guilt, but release. For the first time in years, she felt everything. Her age, her womanhood, her want, and her power. After he whispered, "I've loved you most of my life." She traced his face in the dark. Then let's live what's left of it together. And so they did. Not perfect, not always simple, but real.